Welcome back to Mrs. Kate's YouTube channel. In this chapter, we are focusing on transboundary pollution in Europe. Throughout this chapter, we will be looking at 3 examples of how pollution spreads from one place to another. In Section 3, we will be looking at the Chernobyl radiation accident. In Section 4, we'll be looking at acid rain and the Black Triangle. And in Section 5, we'll look at the Tisza Danube cyanide spill. Soon, we will get started with our first example. But in order to understand the Chernobyl radiation accident, we must first understand what radiation is. That is the purpose of this lecture. For this reason, this lecture will give you some important background information on nuclear energy. During this lecture, we will be answering a series of questions about nuclear energy. These include, how does nuclear energy work? Do a lot of people use nuclear energy? What are some of the benefits of using nuclear energy? What are some of the harms of using nuclear energy? What happens if a nuclear reactor explodes? And how can people protect themselves from nuclear radiation? By the end of this lecture, you should be able to answer all of these questions. As you watch, please fill in your guided notes on page 14 in your workbook. Now, this is different. This time, I'm not going to give you all the answers. Throughout the lecture, you will have to pay attention and listen for the answers. Also, you will receive a homework quiz during the next class to check how well you understood this material. So please pay attention. So let's begin with our first question. How does nuclear energy work? What do you see in this image? Obviously, this is a very large explosion. You may have heard of something called a nuclear bomb. This is a weapon that is very powerful and can be very, very harmful to people. The explosion that you see here is caused by nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is created when very small particles, called molecules, are split into pieces. This is called nuclear fission. You see the red molecule? This is a uranium molecule. This picture is showing how the red uranium is exploding apart, breaking into the purple and orange molecules. As these molecules break apart, they create a large amount of energy and heat. There are 2 types of nuclear energy that I want you to think about, controlled and uncontrolled. So here again is our nuclear fission process. As these molecules break apart, this process might be uncontrolled. This is what leads to the nuclear bomb. On the other hand, scientists have found a way to control the process. When the process is controlled, you can capture the energy. The energy gets captured in the nuclear reactor, where the fission process is taking place. When scientists are capturing this energy, this process takes place at a nuclear power plant. So what is a nuclear power plant? Now this is important. You might be thinking of a living green shrub that grows in your backyard. Maybe a power plant is a plant that is super strong, right? Wrong. This is not a power plant. A power plant is a type of factory. It is a place where people create electricity or power. If you have ever watched The Simpsons, you sometimes see Homer going to work at a place like this. Homer works at a nuclear power plant. In other words, it is a factory where people create power or electricity from nuclear energy. So let's summarize. At these nuclear power plants, nuclear energy can be controlled, and by controlling this energy, we can produce electricity. We're about to move on to our next question. Please take a minute and make sure you filled in the answers in your guided notes on page 14. So on to our next question. Do a lot of people use nuclear energy? The short answer to this question is yes. A lot of people use nuclear energy. Approximately 30% of all of the electricity in Europe comes from nuclear energy. Saudi Arabia hopes to begin producing nuclear energy by the year 2020. By 2030, the government hopes to have up to 60 reactors. This means that you will start to see nuclear power plants all around Saudi Arabia. So why does our government want to do this? What are some of the benefits of using nuclear energy? There are two major benefits of using nuclear energy. First, compared to burning coal and oil, nuclear energy is relatively clean. It does not produce a lot of pollution. Also, nuclear energy is cheap. It doesn't cost a lot of money. But is this a good idea? Do we want our government starting to use nuclear energy? To fully evaluate this idea, we must also answer this question. What are some of the harms of using nuclear energy? The major problem with using nuclear energy is that sometimes, very rarely, it can be dangerous. In most circumstances, when people use nuclear energy, it is controlled. This is what allows us to capture electricity. But if the reactors are not taken care of and they overheat, they can get too hot and they can explode. The energy becomes uncontrolled and you get a large explosion like this. So what happens if a nuclear reactor explodes? If a reactor explodes, it will send nuclear radiation into the air. Radiation has no taste or smell. You can't feel it. But if it's in the air, people will breathe it in. It will land on their skin and go into their bodies. It will also go into the soil and ruin the crops that people eat. When people are exposed to nuclear radiation, they can develop cancer. Cancer can be a deadly disease, especially if it's not treated. What exactly is cancer? You've probably heard of it, and you may even know someone who had it. Your body is made up of tiny cells. Over time, your cells have to reproduce. They divide to create more and more cells. Your body is always producing new cells. But sometimes, your body makes a mistake and produces a bad cell. Usually, the body recognizes this bad cell, and the cell automatically self-destructs. You can think of it as cell suicide. Unfortunately, sometimes the cells don't self-destruct. They go on to divide again. This creates more and more bad cells. The growth of these cells becomes totally uncontrolled. When this happens, it can be very dangerous for the body. This is what cancer is. And this is what can happen if you're exposed to nuclear radiation. So the next question then is obvious. If nuclear radiation can sometimes cause bad things like cancer, how can people protect themselves from nuclear radiation? The people who are most at risk are the people who work at nuclear power plants. These people who work at nuclear power plants often wear protective suits that look like this. This keeps them safe. But sometimes, very rarely when accidents happen, ordinary people can be exposed. And ordinary people don't have these types of suits to protect them. People will become exposed if they live near a nuclear power plant, and the nuclear power plant explodes. Again, this happens only very rarely. But when it does happen, it can be a terrible catastrophe because it exposes people to nuclear radiation. If an explosion happens, people are advised to migrate or to move to another place. This is the only way you can be sure that you're safe. So to conclude our lecture, should we use nuclear power? There are certainly benefits. Nuclear energy is clean, reliable, and affordable. But the bad part is sometimes, again, very rarely, accidents can happen. In class, we're going to talk about a situation when an accident did happen. For now, thank you for watching Mrs. Kate's YouTube channel and for doing your homework. This will make your next geography class much easier. If you have any questions, please write them down in the extra notes page in your workbook and bring them with you to class. Or you can post a comment on this YouTube page or on Schoology.